question of yours. As far as Americanness, yes, it's going to look very different according to the region. Chicago, I think, is a particular case because historically, up until very recently, there's been an almost equal number of Puerto Ricans and Mexicans living in Chicago. Now Mexicans are a larger community in Chicago. So that the whole idea of Latinidad and what it means to be Latino historically in Chicago it's been very singular in a way. It's been a lot about a need to share political power, to very conscientiously construct alliances between the two communities. But then there's also been a lot of tension around the fact that, right, Mexicans are framed as the illegals, the ones who don't have citizenship, and Puerto Ricans have citizenship, even though it's definitely a second-class citizenship, right? So some differences, but some very strong bonds that have been formed, and not just around politics. They've also been around culture, right, and other shared interests. And it does look very different. I'm thinking about, if you look at a city like Miami, Americanness looks entirely different in Miami. And I'm not just saying that because of the most visible, right, Latino population, which in Miami, which tends to be the right-leaning Cuban population, which tends to absorb most of the media attention. The rest of the Latino groups in Miami together outnumber the Cubans by a good amount. But for some reason, we still imagine Miami in a certain way. We imagine New York as a very Puerto Rican space, and while yes, it is historically, it's a very Dominican space too. So I think we're always, in the way in which we imagine these spaces, we're always a couple steps behind what's going on the ground. And this notion of Americanness or Latino-ness or Latinidad is constantly shifting. And as scholars, we're always running to play catch-up, right? To try to figure out what that means. New York is also a very Mexican space right now. But when people say New York, they don't think Mexicano. Even though that is one of the largest and fastest growing groups there. So.
There's in Mexico, at least in Mexico, these two major topics in the public sphere, besides the election. There is one is migration, right?
Yeah.
And I think, or at least the studies that I know, here in the North American Academy treats, it's a very important topic, the migration.
Yes.
The second topic that is in public sphere in Mexico is violence, right? Narco violence, especially, right? Los Tigres del Norte, I think that they too represent migration and violence topics are very important in that. What can you tell me about the treatment that the American Academy makes about the violence in Latin America?
Violence in Latin America. Well, I think the American Academy doesn't treat violence, to the degree that the Mexican Academy does, or the Colombian Academy. So speaking as somebody whose work in Latin America is primarily rooted in Colombia, I can tell you that it's an area of study. They're called violentólogos. Yeah, so is that what they're called in Mexico as well? So it's actually, its own developed field. Within the United States, no, not so much, but there are a good number of scholars that dedicate themselves to the study of violence. And now I'm seeing more scholars that invested in doing sort of comparative studies with Colombia and Mexico in particular.
It is so obvious that migration affects the United States, and that's a major topic here.
Yeah.
It motivates American Academy to study migration.
Yeah.
But I don't know, what are the relationships between academy in North America and academy?
I think the academy, well, I'm thinking of the academy in the United States at least, has more of a grasp on the fact that violence affects the economies, not only the political structures, but the local economies, and that pushes, that's one of the push factors that leads people to immigrate out of Mexico or Colombia, for example. But on the ground, politically in this country, we are still very much fetishizing that notion of immigrants need to be classified as either political or economic immigrants. And as far as the United States government is concerned, even if the academy says it's different, Mexicans are economic immigrants, so they get a very different treatment than, for example, Cuban immigrants, who are classified almost exclusively, to my knowledge, as political immigrants. So, and therefore get very different treatment. One of my various earliest projects was kind of trying to make the argument that Colombians, and I think you could say this about Mexicans, are political and economic migrants because of the violence, because of the drug wars, and what that does to the economy as well as the political structures. I remember having a professor who didn't buy that argument, but she was Cuban and she was very much invested in sort of that, she was very much invested in that traditional dichotomy of political or economic immigrants. So I think the Academy says one thing, that what happens on the ground is something very different. And for the United States to get out of that paradigm or to reject that traditional paradigm of how we classify immigrants, I don't see that happening anytime soon for economic reasons, I think. Yeah. That would mean giving asylum to a lot of people. I think we did, yeah. Well, thank you.
We have a little bit of a break here, and we'll start panel 3 in 15 minutes.